The headlights cut through the bitter December darkness as Michael Thompson, a 34-year-old construction worker, drove home from his late shift on Christmas Eve. Snow was falling heavily, coating the empty highway in a blanket of white silence. But then something impossible caught his eye. Two tiny figures huddled together on the roadside, their small bodies trembling against the freezing wind. As his truck came to a screeching halt, Michael's heart nearly stopped. There, in the middle of nowhere, sat two identical twin girls, no more than 4 years old, clutching each other desperately. Their tear-stained faces looked up at him with eyes full of terror and hope. Little did Michael know that this moment would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the power of Christmas miracles. Michael Thompson had always believed that the worst day of his life was 3 years ago, when his wife Sarah died in a car accident, leaving him to raise their 8-year-old son Jake alone. The 34-year-old construction foreman had built walls around his heart, higher than any building he'd ever constructed. Christmas Eve meant nothing to him anymore, just another reminder of the family traditions that had died with Sarah. The overtime shift at the construction site had been a blessing in disguise. While other families were gathering around Christmas trees, Michael preferred the numbing routine of work. The physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant ache in his chest. His weathered hands, calloused from years of manual labor, gripped the steering wheel as he navigated the increasingly treacherous roads toward home. Jake was spending Christmas Eve with his grandparents, Sarah's parents, who worried constantly about Michael's emotional withdrawal. They'd begged him to join them for Christmas dinner, but Michael had declined with the same excuse he'd used for months. Too much work, too many responsibilities. The truth was simpler and more painful. Celebrating anything felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. The snowstorm had intensified during his drive home, transforming the familiar highway into an alien landscape. The radio crackled with weather warnings and road closures, but Michael pressed on, eager to reach the empty house that had once been filled with laughter and love. His truck's heater worked overtime against the December cold, but nothing could warm the chill that had settled permanently in his soul. That's when he saw them. At first, Michael thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. The snow was coming down so hard that visibility was almost zero. But as his headlights swept across the roadside, there was no mistaking what he saw. Two small figures pressed together against a bare oak tree, their tiny forms barely visible against the white backdrop. Michael's foot hit the brake so hard, his truck skidded slightly on the icy pavement. His heart hammered against his ribcage as he pulled over, hazard lights flashing like warning beacons in the storm. The rational part of his mind wondered if this was some kind of hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But his father's instincts were already taking over. He grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and he couldn't imagine how two small children could survive even minutes in these conditions. As he approached, the beam of his flashlight revealed the heartbreaking truth. Two identical twin girls, probably no older than 4, wearing nothing but thin pajamas and small boots that offered little protection against the elements. Their blonde hair was matted with snow, their lips were blue from cold, and their small bodies shook uncontrollably. But it was their eyes that broke something inside Michael's chest. Wide, terrified, but somehow still holding on to a flicker of hope. They clung to each other like lifelines, and when his light fell on them, they didn't run. Instead, they looked up at him with the desperate trust that only children possess. Michael's construction worker exterior cracked completely in that moment. These weren't just any children. They were babies, abandoned and helpless, facing certain death in the storm. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy work coat and wrapped both girls in it, their small bodies fitting easily within its warmth. Michael's hands trembled as he carefully lifted both girls, surprised by how light they felt in his arms. They couldn't weigh more than 30 pounds each, their small frames fragile as bird bones. The twins pressed against his chest, seeking warmth and safety, their silent trust both humbling and terrifying. He could feel their rapid heartbeats through their thin clothing, and the realization of how close they'd come to freezing to death made his stomach clench with fear. Getting them into his truck was a careful operation. The cabin felt like a sanctuary compared to the brutal cold outside, and Michael quickly cranked the heat to maximum. The twins sat huddled together on the passenger seat, still wrapped in his coat, their wide eyes taking in their surroundings with a mixture of wonder and wariness. They hadn't spoken a single word since he'd found them, but their silence spoke volumes about whatever trauma they'd endured. Michael's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. What kind of monster would abandon two small children on a highway in the middle of a blizzard? The questions multiplied in his head, but the immediate priority was clear. These girls needed medical attention, warmth, and safety. His phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given the remote location and severe weather. As feeling returned to the twins' extremities, they began to whimper softly from the pain of warming up. Michael recognized the signs of mild hypothermia from his construction safety training. Their fingers and toes would hurt as circulation returned, but they appeared to have avoided frostbite. He found an old blanket behind his seat and wrapped it around them both, creating a cocoon of warmth. The drive to town felt eternal. Every few minutes, Michael glanced over at the twins, making sure they were still breathing, still responsive. Their eyes never left his face, as if he were the only steady point in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. The weight of their trust pressed against his chest like a physical force. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was nearly empty on Christmas Eve, with only a skeleton crew on duty. The fluorescent light seemed harsh after the intimate darkness of the truck cabin, and the twins pressed closer together as Michael carried them through the automatic doors. The warm antiseptic smell and busy sounds of the hospital seemed to overwhelm them after their silent ordeal. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a 42-year-old pediatrician with kind eyes and gentle hands, took charge immediately. Her experience with trauma cases was evident in how she moved slowly and spoke softly, giving the twins time to adjust to each new person and situation. The medical examination revealed what Michael had feared: mild hypothermia, dehydration, and signs of prolonged neglect, but miraculously no severe injuries. While the twins were being treated, Michael found himself pacing the waiting room, his emotions a tangled mess of relief, anger, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The hospital social worker, Patricia Williams, a 38-year-old woman with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, approached him with a clipboard and too many questions he couldn't answer. The twins, it turned out, had no identification, no missing person reports, nothing to indicate who they were or where they'd come from. Patricia explained the protocol. Child Protective Services would be contacted, the police would investigate, and the girls would likely be placed in emergency foster care while authorities tried to piece together their story. The system would take over, cold and efficient, processing two more damaged children through its machinery. But as Michael watched through the window of their room, seeing how the twins clung to each other and searched the doorway hopefully every time footsteps approached, he felt something awakening in his chest that he'd thought had died with Sarah. It was a fierce, protective instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the way they'd looked at him on that dark highway, with complete, desperate trust. The nurses had cleaned them up and dressed them in hospital gowns that were comically large on their tiny frames. They were beautiful children, with identical heart-shaped faces, bright blue eyes and blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends. But it was more than their appearance that caught at Michael's heart. It was the way they comforted each other, patting each other's arms and sharing silent communications that spoke of a bond forged by shared trauma and survival. Michael couldn't bring himself to leave the hospital that night. He'd called Jake's grandparents to explain he'd be delayed, though he couldn't fully articulate why he felt compelled to stay. Something about the twins' silent vigil in their hospital beds, the way they held hands even while sleeping, kept him anchored to the uncomfortable waiting room chair. Dr. Martinez found him there at dawn, bringing coffee and the kind of gentle concern that made her exceptional at working with traumatized children. She explained that the twins appeared to be healthy despite their ordeal, but showed signs of selective mutism, a psychological response to trauma where children stop speaking. Their behavior suggested they'd been caring for each other for some time, possibly weeks or even months. When Patricia from Child Services arrived that morning, Michael felt his chest tighten with unexpected anxiety. She carried folders and forms that would reduce these two little girls to case numbers and placement statistics. The system would do its best, she assured him, but Christmas weekend meant limited options. Emergency foster homes were scarce, and the twins would likely have to be separated temporarily. The word separated hit Michael like a physical blow. He'd seen how the twins communicated without words, how they seemed to share not just thoughts but actual pain and comfort. Separating them would be like tearing a single person in half. His own experience of loss, of having half of himself ripped away when Sarah died, made him understand exactly what that separation would do to these children. When he was finally allowed back into their room, the twins' faces lit up with recognition and relief. They didn't smile. Michael suspected it had been a long time since they'd had reason to smile, but their entire bodies relaxed when they saw him. One of them, slightly smaller than her sister, reached out tentatively toward him. Michael found himself moving closer, letting her tiny hand wrap around one of his calloused fingers. That simple touch broke something open in Michael's heart that he'd kept locked away for 3 years. The protective instinct he'd felt as a father, the fierce love that had made him willing to do anything for Jake, suddenly expanded to include these two lost souls. It wasn't rational or planned or convenient. It was as natural and inevitable as breathing. He spent the day with them, learning their silent language of gestures and glances. The smaller twin seemed more cautious, more easily startled, while her sister positioned herself as protector, always stepping slightly forward when strangers approached. They shared everything: food, space, even their breathing seemed synchronized. Medical staff had started referring to them as Twin A and Twin B, but Michael found himself thinking of them as the little angels who had appeared on the darkest night of the year. Patricia returned in the afternoon with news that confirmed Michael's worst fears. No emergency foster homes could take both twins together, at least not over the holiday weekend. The best available option was a foster family 2 hours away, who could take one child, and another placement for the second twin in a different county entirely. They would be separated, possibly for weeks, while the investigation continued. The twins seemed to sense the tension in the adults around them. They pressed closer together in their shared hospital bed, their eyes moving between Michael and Patricia, with growing anxiety. Michael watched their silent communication, the way they comforted each other without words, and felt his resolve crystallizing into something unshakable. He'd lost Sarah to circumstances beyond his control, had spent 3 years drowning in grief and isolation. But these children were here now, needing exactly what he had to give: protection, safety, and the fierce love of someone who understood what it meant to lose everything. Jake had been asking for years when they might become a bigger family again. Maybe this was the answer to prayers Michael had been too broken to say. The decision formed in his mind with startling clarity. These twins had saved him as much as he'd saved them, pulling him back from the edge of complete emotional shutdown. They needed each other, and somehow, inexplicably, they needed him too. Michael had never imagined himself filling out emergency foster care applications on Christmas morning, but life had a way of destroying all his carefully laid plans. The social services office was closed for the holiday, but Patricia had agreed to meet him at the hospital to discuss what she called an unusual but not impossible solution. Her years in the system had made her practical about unconventional placements when traditional options failed. The background checks would take time, she explained, but Michael's clean record, stable employment, and existing experience as a single parent worked in his favor. More importantly, the twins had clearly bonded with him in a way that was remarkable given their trauma. In all her years of social work, Patricia had rarely seen children respond so positively to a potential caregiver so quickly. Jake arrived at the hospital that morning with his grandparents, curious about the emergency that had kept his father away from their Christmas plans. The 8-year-old boy with Sarah's gentle eyes and Michael's stubborn chin stopped short when he saw the twins, his young face cycling through surprise, curiosity, and something that looked remarkably like recognition. The twins, meanwhile, watched Jake with the same careful attention they'd given every new person, but without their usual fear. Children, it seemed, read other children differently than adults. Jake approached them with the natural confidence of someone who'd never learned to fear the world, chattering easily about Christmas and presents and how hospital food was probably terrible, but he'd brought cookies from Grandma. For the first time since Michael had found them, the twins showed something that might have been amusement. The smaller one's lips twitched in what could have been the ghost of a smile, while her sister tilted her head with genuine interest as Jake described his elaborate plans for building snow forts once the storm passed. Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen, were the kind of people who had spent their lives opening their hearts to strays and lost souls. They'd welcomed Michael into their family when he'd married their daughter, and they'd helped hold him together when grief threatened to destroy him. Now faced with two traumatized children, who clearly needed everything a family could provide, their response was immediate and practical. Helen, a 58-year-old retired teacher with silver hair and laugh lines, took one look at the twins and began mentally reorganizing bedrooms and Christmas dinner plans. Robert, a 60-year-old former carpenter with gentle hands and infinite patience, saw the way Michael looked at the children and recognized the first spark of life he'd seen in his son-in-law's eyes since Sarah's death. The logistics were daunting. Michael's two-bedroom house would need modifications. There would be court dates, home visits, therapy appointments, and a mountain of paperwork that would make his construction contracts look simple. But as the family sat together in that hospital room on Christmas morning, something magical happened. They began to feel like a unit, a constellation of people who belonged together despite the chaos of how they'd found each other. The twins seemed to sense the shift in energy around them. They were still silent, still cautious, but they began to move slightly beyond their protective bubble of two. The smaller twin accepted a stuffed animal from Helen without flinching, while her sister allowed Jake to show her pictures on his phone without pulling away. Michael watched this gradual opening with a mixture of hope and terror. Taking in these children meant opening himself up to the possibility of loss again, of loving something so much that losing it would destroy him. But as he saw Jake carefully explaining the rules of some video game to his potential new sisters, as he watched his in-laws instinctively make space for two more grandchildren, he realized that some risks were worth taking. The truth was, he'd already fallen in love with these two small survivors. From the moment he'd wrapped them in his coat on that frozen highway, they'd become his responsibility, his purpose, his chance at healing not just their trauma but his own. 2 weeks later, Michael found himself standing in his transformed living room on New Year's Day, watching three children play together with the easy familiarity of siblings who'd known each other forever. The emergency foster placement had become official, with adoption proceedings scheduled to begin in the spring. The twins, who had finally whispered their names, Emma and Grace, were slowly beginning to speak in short sentences, their voices soft and careful but growing stronger each day. The investigation into their abandonment had yielded heartbreaking results. Their birth mother, struggling with addiction and mental illness, had left them with a friend who had subsequently abandoned them when the situation became too difficult. The trail had gone cold after that, until Michael found them on Christmas Eve. The legal proceedings would take months, but the outcome seemed certain. These children needed the stability and love that Michael and his expanded family could provide. Jake had embraced his role as big brother with the enthusiasm he brought to everything in his young life. He'd moved into Michael's room temporarily so the twins could share his bedroom, decorated with princess stickers and stuffed animals that Helen had supplied in abundance. The boy, who had spent 3 years as an only child, was thriving as the protective older sibling, teaching his new sisters about everything from tying shoes to building elaborate pillow forts. The twins were healing, slowly but visibly. Emma, the smaller and more cautious of the two, had attached herself to Helen, following the grandmother figure around the house and helping with cooking and household tasks. Grace, the protector, had formed an unbreakable bond with Jake, shadowing him everywhere and fiercely defending him from any perceived slight. But both girls saved their deepest trust for Michael, the man who had rescued them from their darkest hour. Dr. Martinez had warned that recovery from trauma was rarely linear. There would be setbacks, nightmares, days when fear would overtake progress. But she was amazed by how quickly the twins had begun to open up in the security of a loving family environment. Their selective mutism was gradually giving way to whispered conversations, then normal speech, then even occasional laughter. Michael often found himself thinking about that Christmas Eve night, about the chain of seemingly random events that had brought them all together. If he hadn't worked late, if he'd taken a different route home, if he hadn't looked up at exactly the right moment, the twins would have died in that storm, and his family would have remained forever incomplete. Sarah's parents had embraced their role as emergency grandparents with the same wholehearted love they'd shown Jake. Robert had already begun teaching the twins basic woodworking skills in his garage workshop, while Helen had enrolled them in a preschool program designed for children recovering from trauma. The support system that had helped Michael survive his own grief was now surrounding Emma and Grace with the same protective love. The legal adoption process would take months more to complete, but in every way that mattered, the twins were already home. They had Mickey Mouse pancakes for breakfast, story time before bed, and the security of knowing that tomorrow would bring the same safe routine. They were learning to be children again, to trust that adults could be protectors instead of threats, to believe in their own worth and lovability. On this New Year's Day, as Michael watched Jake teaching the twins how to play a board game they were probably too young to understand, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: complete happiness. Not the desperate, grasping kind that fears its own fragility, but the deep, steady contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the people you're meant to love. The twins had given him back his purpose, his capacity for joy, his belief in the possibility of healing. In saving them, they had saved him right back. The man who had spent 3 years convinced that his story was ending had discovered instead that it was just beginning a new chapter, one filled with the chaos and beauty of raising 3 children who needed everything he had to give. Emma looked up from the game board and smiled at him, not the tentative, careful expression she'd worn for weeks, but a real smile full of mischief and trust and love. Grace joined her sister in grinning at their father, and Jake threw his arms around all of them in the kind of spontaneous group hug that had become a daily occurrence in their house. Michael hugged them back, these 3 beautiful children who had made him whole again, and silently thanked whatever force had put him on that highway on Christmas Eve to witness the most important miracle of his life.